The movie begins with a man named Solomon. He was a talented musician, well known enough to lead a decent life in Saratoga Springs, New York. Solomon lived freely despite being part of the African American population during a challenging historical period. One day, he met two strangers who introduced themselves as performers. They offered him the opportunity to join their performances in Washington, promising good pay for 2 weeks of work. Solomon accepted the offer and set off with them to begin the performances. The show was a success, and to celebrate, they invited him to dine at a restaurant. During the meal, Solomon consumed a large amount of alcohol until he lost consciousness. The next morning, he woke up bound and realized he was in a place resembling a prison. After some time, two men appeared. Solomon explained to them that he was a free citizen, had a family, and lived in Saratoga Springs, New York. However, the men did not believe him and claimed that Solomon was a runaway worker from Georgia. Despite his attempts to prove otherwise, he was beaten. Later, another man appeared and demanded that Solomon change into the clothes he was given. He and other people were secretly transported at night in a wagon to an unknown destination. Solomon and the other captives were forced aboard a ship. One of them warned Solomon to hide his ability to read and write, because if the people involved in illegal human trafficking discovered it, they might kill him. If he wanted to stay alive, he needed to speak and act as little as possible. On the ship, one of the white crew members forcibly took a black girl with the intention of assaulting her. One of the men tried to intervene, which enraged the assailant. The white man, in a fit of rage, stabbed him with a knife. Solomon and the others were shocked by what had happened. They were ordered to throw the deceased overboard. Upon arrival at the port, they were presented to a certain man. When Solomon tried to state his real name, this man struck him. After that, Solomon and the other captives were taken to a shelter. There, Solomon met a woman named Eliza and her two children. They were forced to tidy themselves up and were then put up for auction. A man named Mr. Ford, who was looking for workers, arrived at the market. After inspecting everyone, he decided to purchase Solomon and Eliza. Unfortunately, Eliza was forced to part with her children. With no right to resist, they complied with the circumstances. Solomon, now called Platt, and Eliza were taken to Mr. Ford's home. Eliza constantly cried over the separation from her children. Her tears made Platt feel uncomfortable. He tried to console her, but to no avail. Soon, because of her crying, Eliza was taken away, and no one ever saw her again. Platt began working for Mr. Ford. At his new place, he was often criticized by Tibeats, the plantation overseer. Tibeats could not stand anyone smarter than him and hated those who stood out. One day, Mr. Ford, along with Platt and other workers, went to the forest for timber. He was contemplating the best way to transport it, by land or by water. Platt suggested tying the timber into a raft and floating it down the river. Tibeats mocked the idea and expressed his displeasure. However, Mr. Ford allowed Platt to implement his plan, which turned out to be successful. For this, Mr. Ford praised Platt, and the other workers, except for Tibeats, supported him. As a token of gratitude, Mr. Ford gifted Platt a musical instrument. One day, Platt was assigned to build a small house. Tibeats, envious of his success, came and attacked him, but Platt, unwilling to endure injustice, fought back, injuring Tibeats in the process. Later, seeking revenge, Tibeats brought two men, and they attacked Platt. He was beaten and hung from a tree. Fortunately, Chapin, the senior overseer, intervened, stopped them, and threatened consequences. Despite this, Platt was left hanging from the tree, barely touching the ground to avoid suffocation. In the evening, Mr. Ford returned home, freed Platt, and took him to the house. He said it was dangerous for Platt to stay there as Tibeats might try to harm him again. To save his life and address his financial troubles, Mr. Ford decided to transfer Solomon to Mr. Epps. Mr. Epps was notorious for his cruelty toward the workers. He did not hesitate to use the whip if they made mistakes. At Mr. Epps's plantation, Platt and the other captives worked picking cotton. Among them was a girl named Patsy, who stood out for her productivity. She could pick 500 pounds of cotton, while others gathered around 300. Because of this, Patsy became Mr. Epps's favorite. One night, Mr. Epps woke all the workers and forced them to dance for his entertainment. Suddenly, his wife, Mrs. Epps, threw a vase at Patsy. She was jealous of her husband's attention to Patsy and demanded he get rid of her. "Sell her! Get her out of the house!" Mrs. Epps shouted. But Mr. Epps refused, which only intensified her anger. Later, Mrs. Epps called Platt and sent him to the store. During their conversation, she asked where he was from and whether he could read or write. Platt lied, saying he was from Washington and could neither read nor write. On the way to the store, he thought about escaping, but soon saw two landowners preparing to punish their workers. One of them noticed Platt and asked who his owner was and why he was there. Frightened, Platt replied that Mr. Epps had sent him, after which they allowed him to leave. Shaken by the encounter, Platt abandoned the thought of escape and returned to his duties. Late at night, Mr. Epps entered Patsy's room and used her to satisfy his desires. She could not resist and was left alone after he departed. The next day, Mrs. Epps sent Platt on another errand. When he returned, he noticed a piece of paper left by Mrs. Epps and stole it. He hid it, hoping it would be useful in the future. That evening, the workers were forced to dance again. Mrs. Epps handed out food to everyone except Patsy, trying to provoke her husband. But her plan failed, and in a fit of rage, she inflicted injuries on Patsy. All the trials Patsy endured, including her hard labor, Mr. Epps's cruelty, and the abuse led her to despair. She begged Platt to end her suffering as she no longer saw any meaning in life. Over time, Mr. Epps's cotton fields were infested with pests. As a result, he decided to temporarily send his workers to Judge Turner. Before sending them, he sternly warned them not to tell the judge about his behavior. At Judge Turner's plantation, the workers harvested sugarcane. The work there was easier as the judge treated them with respect. Platt received praise for his skills and diligence. One day, the judge learned that Platt could play a musical instrument. When a friend of his needed a musician for a celebration, the judge offered Platt's services. Moreover, Platt was allowed to keep the money he earned. Before leaving for the celebration, Platt carved the names of his wife and children into his instrument to express his longing for them. Soon the pest infestation ended, and the workers were returned to Mr. Epps. A new man named Armsby arrived at the plantation, a white man forced to work. He had previously been an overseer but lost his position due to alcohol addiction. Left without means to survive, he agreed to work to make ends meet. However, due to his status, Armsby enjoyed privileges. Even when he failed to perform his duties, he was not punished but instead supported. Feeling a sense of trust toward Armsby, Platt asked him for help in sending a letter to New York. Armsby agreed. Platt wrote the letter using stolen paper, berries as ink, and a twig as a pen. A few days later, Mr. Epps summoned Platt. He had learned that Platt had tried to send a letter, but Platt quickly came up with an excuse and lied, claiming he could neither read nor write, and accusing Armsby of trying to frame him. Fortunately, Mr. Epps believed him, and Platt avoided punishment. However, this incident forced him to destroy the letter he had hoped to send to his loved ones. Later, while the workers were going about their tasks, one of them suddenly lost consciousness and soon passed away. Everyone was saddened by this event, as they had endured many hardships together and considered each other family. Years later, Mr. Epps decided to build a new house. He hired a Canadian named Bass, who was a skilled builder. One day, Bass struck up a conversation with Platt. He expressed surprise at the existence of slavery in America. Bass believed it was unjust and violated human rights. All men are equal, and what is right for one must be right for all, he said. One day, Mr. Epps could not find Patsy. He became furious and demanded answers, but no one knew where she was. Later, Patsy returned and explained that she had gone to Mrs. Shaw to get soap since Mrs. Epps had refused to give her any. But Mr. Epps refused to listen to her explanation. Mrs. Epps took advantage of the situation to accuse Patsy. Enraged, Mr. Epps ordered her to be stripped and forced Platt to punish her. Platt pitied her and struck her lightly, but Mr. Epps noticed. He pointed a weapon at Platt and forced him to strike harder. Later, Mr. Epps himself began whipping her, nearly killing Patsy. The severe injuries she sustained filled Platt with guilt. In despair, he broke the violin that Mr. Ford had once given him as a gift. Eventually, Platt spoke to Bass and told him his real name was Solomon and that he was a free man from New York. Bass was shocked. Solomon asked him to help send a letter to his friend Parker. Bass hesitated as it could put him at risk. However, he agreed. Freedom is the most important thing. You write it, and I'll deliver the letter, he said. Sometime later, the sheriff unexpectedly arrived at the plantation. While Platt was working in the field, the sheriff approached and began asking questions. Platt recognized his friend. Parker had come for him. The sheriff asked him about his real name and family. Platt confidently replied that his name was Solomon Northup. After that, he embraced Parker, whom he had not seen in 12 years. Mr. Epps tried to stop them, but the sheriff threatened him with arrest. He declared that Solomon was a free man and that the law was now on his side. Before leaving, Patsy said goodbye to Solomon and hugged him. It was hard for him to leave her, but he had no choice. Upon returning home, Solomon reclaimed his name. He was overwhelmed to see how much his family had changed over 12 years. His grown daughter introduced him to her husband and said she had a son named after him. Later, Solomon discovered he had been a victim of a criminal group involved in illegal trafficking. He decided to seek justice and took his kidnappers to court. However, due to bias, the court acquitted the criminals. Despite this, Solomon did not give up. He wrote a book about his 12 years in slavery and became an activist fighting against injustice.